Trust. It's what holds a family together. But what happens when that trust is shattered, not by a stranger, but by the people closest to you? A husband. A wife. And a mother-in-law with a secret too dangerous to keep. It started with stolen moments. Hidden touches. Words whispered where they shouldn't have been. A secret love affair that was never meant to see the light of day. But when passion turned to paranoia, and betrayal led to desperation, the only way out was death. Welcome to Crime Quarter, where the most chilling true crime stories come to life. If you love gripping cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. I drop new, bone-chilling cases every single day, so don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because in the world of crime, the next twist is always around the corner. Now, let's get into today's case. Jacob Smith was the kind of man people trusted without question. A devoted husband, a loving father, a reliable provider. He woke up early every morning, kissed his wife on the forehead, and left for work without fail. He helped with homework in the evenings, mowed the lawn on Sundays, and remembered anniversaries. To everyone who knew him, Jacob was a good man. Linda had never doubted that. They had been together since they were teenagers, their love growing from youthful infatuation into something deeper, something real. Their marriage was built on trust, or at least, that's what Linda believed. She never imagined that the very foundation of their life together was rotting beneath her feet. But something had changed. She had felt it before she understood it, before she had proof. It was in the way Jacob hesitated before answering simple questions, the way his eyes darted away from hers when she spoke. It was in the way he touched her, less frequently, less gently. At first, she told herself she was imagining things. That work was stressful, that they were just in a rough patch. It happened to all marriages, didn't it? And then there was her mother, Grace. Grace had always been a constant presence in their lives. After Linda's father passed away, she had leaned on her daughter's family for support. She spent nights at their home, helped with their daughter, joined them for family dinners. Linda never questioned it. Her mother was lonely. She needed them. But something wasn't right. Linda started noticing things, small, insignificant on their own, but together, they formed a picture she didn't want to see. An extra glass in the sink when she knew only two had been used. The faint scent of perfume, her mother's perfume, on the living room couch. The way Grace's laughter carried through the house at odd hours of the night, always after Linda had gone to bed. Then, the text message. It had been an accident. Jacob had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and when it buzzed, Linda barely glanced at it, until she saw the name. Grace. She froze. Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen. One message. Just a few words. Last night was amazing. Can't wait for tonight. Her hands shook as she unlocked the phone. Message after message, stretching back months. Late night rendezvous. Whispered confessions. A love she never saw coming. Her mother. Her husband. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. She could hear the water running in the bathroom, Jacob humming softly. As if nothing had changed. As if he wasn't the man in those messages, professing his love to her mother, promising her things he had once promised Linda. She couldn't breathe. She didn't remember putting the phone down. She didn't remember walking away. All she knew was that something inside her had snapped. Something that couldn't be undone. She had two choices, confront them, or let them believe their secret was still safe. Linda chose to wait. To watch. To see how far this betrayal had gone. She paid attention to things she had ignored before. The way Jacob and Grace exchanged glances across the dinner table, the way her mother's hand would linger on his arm just a second too long. The way he would disappear in the middle of the night, only to return with an excuse she once would have believed. But the worst part wasn't the lies. It was the realization that the people she loved most had never loved her enough to stop. And when the final betrayal came, Linda knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't going to end with just broken hearts. It was going to end with someone dead. It started with small moments, fleeting glances across the room, a lingering touch that lasted just a second too long, shared laughter over inside jokes that no one else in the house understood. Grace had always been an elegant woman, the kind who carried herself with an effortless confidence that drew people in without her even trying. Even after the death of her husband, she still had a way of captivating those around her, of making people feel like they were the only ones in the room when she spoke to them. Jacob noticed. At first, it was nothing more than harmless conversation, small talk exchanged over morning coffee while Linda was busy getting their daughter ready for school. Grace would sit across from him at the kitchen table, swirling her spoon idly in her coffee as she talked about the challenges of starting over after her marriage ended, about the loneliness that crept in at night when she lay in bed alone, about the frustration of feeling like the best years of her life had already passed her by. Jacob listened. He nodded in all the right places, laughed when she made jokes, and reassured her when she sighed about growing older. He never thought much of it at first. After all, Grace was his mother-in-law. It wasn't unusual for them to have conversations like this. But then something shifted, something so subtle that it was almost imperceptible at first. The way she looked at him started to change, her gaze lingering just a moment too long. Her compliments became more personal, laced with an underlying meaning he couldn't quite put his finger on. She started to touch him more, just little things, like brushing her hand against his when she handed him a cup of coffee, or resting her fingers on his arm when she laughed. One night, while Linda was upstairs putting their daughter to bed, Grace stayed in the kitchen with Jacob, pouring herself another glass of wine. The conversation drifted, as it always did, but this time, there was something different about the way she spoke to him. She leaned in slightly, her voice lower, softer. She told him he was different from other men, that he actually listened to her, that he made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was a comment that should have meant nothing, just a passing remark, but the way she looked at him when she said it made his stomach twist. Jacob should have ignored it. He should have excused himself, walked away, pretended he didn't notice the way her breath hitched slightly as she waited for his response. But he didn't. That night, something between them changed. Their conversations became longer, their interactions more intimate. Grace started confiding in him, telling him things she had never told anyone, not even Linda. She spoke about regrets, about the mistakes she had made in her life, about the things she wished she could do over. And Jacob, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, found himself opening up to her, too. He told her things he had never told Linda, thoughts and doubts and fears he had kept buried deep inside. The tension between them grew thicker, heavier, impossible to ignore. Then, one night, it finally happened. The first kiss was stolen in the basement, quick, desperate, as if both of them knew they were crossing a line they could never uncross but were too far gone to stop. Jacob barely had time to process what was happening before Grace pulled him back in, whispering that Linda was asleep upstairs, that no one would ever have to know. That night, everything changed. Their affair didn't stop with that one reckless moment. Instead, it became a dangerous game, a secret world that only the two of them inhabited. They became bolder, more reckless. Grace would brush against him in the hallway when Linda wasn't looking, flash him a knowing smirk from across the dinner table, and send him messages late at night that made his heart race with both excitement and fear. "Meet me in the basement. Linda is asleep. I can't stop thinking about you." At first, they were careful. They made sure to delete their messages, to keep their meetings short, to act normal whenever Linda was around. But as the weeks passed, the temptation became too strong, the secrecy too intoxicating. They began taking more risks, sneaking off when Linda was at work, finding excuses to be alone together, letting their hands linger just a little too long when passing each other in the kitchen. Jacob told himself it was just a fling, that it was nothing serious, that it would end before anyone got hurt. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just an affair anymore. It was an obsession. And obsessions never end well. Jacob and Grace thought they were being careful, that no one would ever suspect what was happening right under Linda's nose. But secrets have a way of surfacing. And what they didn't realize was that someone was watching. Their affair wasn't as hidden as they thought. And soon, their betrayal would lead to something far worse than they ever could have imagined. It started with small things, little details that didn't seem to mean much on their own, but together, they painted a picture that Linda couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. One night, she heard a whisper through the walls, too faint to make out the words, but distinct enough to make her pause and wonder. Another night, she noticed a single wine glass sitting in the sink, even though she hadn't had any wine that evening. The scent of perfume lingered in the air, subtle but unfamiliar, and it wasn't hers. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than coincidence or a trick of her mind playing on her exhaustion. She reassured herself that she was overthinking things, that she was imagining patterns where there were none, and that Jacob had never given her a reason to doubt him before. They had been together for years, built a life side by side, and if something was wrong, she would have known, wouldn't she? But once the seed of doubt had been planted, it was impossible to unsee the things that once felt insignificant, impossible to ignore the quiet feeling in her gut that something wasn't right. One evening, as she folded laundry in their bedroom, she absent-mindedly grabbed Jacob's shirt from the pile and began to smooth it out before placing it on the hanger. It was his usual crisp button-up, the one he wore to work, the one she had washed 100 times before. But as she brought it closer to inspect it, a faint mark on the collar caught her attention. Her heart clenched as she examined it under the light, the unmistakable smudge of lipstick staining the fabric. She froze, staring at the stain as her mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was from a coworker, an accidental brush of makeup during a greeting, or maybe it had been there for weeks and she had simply never noticed. Maybe, just maybe, she was overreacting. But the longer she stared at it, the harder it became to convince herself that this was nothing. A few nights later, she found something else, something that erased any doubt she had left. As she helped Jacob retrieve his jacket from the hallway closet, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor. She bent down, picking it up with a puzzled expression, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The words were written in neat, familiar handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste. "I can't stop thinking about last night. I need you." There was no name, no signature, nothing that directly gave away the sender. But Linda knew that handwriting, recognized the curve of each letter, the way the loops curled in a way she had seen countless times before. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization slammed into her like a freight train. It was her mother's. Her stomach twisted violently as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, forming a picture she had never imagined, one she didn't want to see. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air becoming too thick to breathe, the ground beneath her shifting in a way that made her dizzy. But even then, she tried to reason with herself, tried to push the thought away before it could fully take hold. There had to be another explanation. There had to be some kind of mistake. But the final confirmation came just days later, and this time, there was no room for denial. Jacob had fallen asleep on the couch, his phone resting on the coffee table beside him, the screen briefly lighting up with a notification. Linda had never been the type to check his phone, had never felt the need to invade his privacy, but tonight, something told her she had to. A deep, gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach urged her forward, telling her that this time, she wouldn't be overreacting. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone, swiping at the screen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. And there it was, plain as day, staring back at her like a cruel confirmation of her worst fears. "I love you. But she can never find out." The message was from Grace. Linda's breath hitched as the phone slipped slightly in her grasp, her vision blurring as the weight of reality came crashing down around her. The sickening truth settled deep in her chest, suffocating her, twisting and churning like a blade being slowly pushed into her ribs. Her mother. Her husband. The two people she trusted most, betraying her in the most unforgivable way possible. She felt the room spinning, her fingers clutching onto the phone like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her mind screamed at her to wake up, to shake off whatever nightmare she had fallen into, but this wasn't a dream. This was real. This was happening. And as she stood there, heartbroken, furious, humiliated, and drowning in emotions she couldn't even name, she realized she had a choice to make. Would she confront them now, unleashing the storm that had been building inside her? Would she pretend she didn't know, gathering more evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Or would she simply leave, walking away before their betrayal could destroy her any further? One thing was clear, after tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. Linda stood frozen, the glow of Jacob's phone screen still illuminating the message that had shattered her world, her pulse pounding in her ears, drowning out every rational thought, every excuse she might have clung to just moments before, as the words burned into her mind like a scar, "I love you. But she can never find out." A final confirmation of the betrayal she had been too afraid to fully acknowledge. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, her breath shallow and uneven, her mind racing in 1,000 directions at once, making her feel sick, like the floor beneath her had been ripped away, leaving her plummeting into an abyss with no end. But amidst the chaos in her head, one thought rose above the rest, clear and undeniable: she needed answers. Linda stormed into the bedroom where Jacob lay sleeping, the betrayal heavy in her chest, burning through the last threads of composure she had left, and without hesitation, without thinking about softening the blow, because there was no way to sugarcoat something like this, she spoke, her voice low but sharp as a knife, demanding, "Wake up." Jacob stirred, groggily opening his eyes, but the moment he saw the look on her face, the tension in the room shifted, and he sat up quickly, rubbing his face, his expression a mix of confusion and unease as he asked, feigning innocence, his voice thick with sleep, "What's wrong?" Linda clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay steady even as the rage boiled inside her, and she snapped, "Don't do that. Don't act like nothing's wrong." Jacob frowned, his brow furrowing in frustration, and he exhaled heavily before asking, "Linda, what are you talking about?" Without breaking eye contact, she grabbed his phone off the nightstand and held it up for him to see, her fingers gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white as she hissed, This is what I'm talking about." Jacob's eyes flickered to the screen, and in that split second, before he could school his expression into something neutral, she saw it, the guilt, the panic, the realization that he had been caught, written all over his face, so painfully obvious that it made her stomach churn, but still, he tried to lie. "This isn't what you think," he said quickly, swinging his legs over the bed, his voice taking on that careful, measured tone he always used when he was trying to defuse an argument, as he continued, "Linda, you're overreacting. Grace and we're just close. It's not what you're making it out to be." Linda let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief, and she repeated, her voice trembling with fury, "Overreacting," as she took a sharp breath, her eyes never leaving his face, before continuing, "You've been sneaking around with my mother, Jacob. I found the notes, the lipstick on your collar, the perfume. And now, this." She waved the phone in front of him, her voice rising as she demanded, "How long were you planning to lie to me?" Jacob ran a hand through his hair, sighing heavily, his shoulders tensing, and he muttered, "You don't understand," but Linda wasn't interested in his excuses, wasn't willing to hear another word of deception, and she cut him off, stepping closer, her voice shaking with rage as she spat, "No, I do understand. I understand that the two people I trusted the most have been betraying me right under my nose. I understand that you've been lying to my face for God knows how long. And I understand that I was stupid enough to believe you loved me. Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but Linda wasn't done. The fury, the heartbreak, the months of doubt and confusion all erupting at once, spilling out in a wave of raw, unfiltered emotion as she seethed. "You disgust me. You and Grace both." Jacob's jaw tightened, and he started again, his voice softer, trying to regain control. "Linda, please, just listen." But a sudden thought hit her like a lightning bolt, her breath catching in her throat, and for the first time, fear crept into her anger as she took a step back, her mind racing with a new, more horrifying possibility as she whispered, "How long has this been going on?" Then locked eyes with him, her expression unreadable, her voice quieter now but laced with something darker, before she repeated, slower this time, "Tell me the truth, Jacob." Jacob hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough, and Linda turned on her heel, storming out of the bedroom, her body running on pure adrenaline as she moved through the house with purpose, ignoring Jacob's voice calling after her, ignoring the sound of his footsteps behind her as she headed straight to the office where she kept the home security system's backup hard drive. She had installed the cameras months ago, originally for safety, never imagining they would capture something like this, and now, with shaking hands, she plugged the hard drive into her laptop, her heart hammering against her ribs, the screen flickering to life as she clicked through the timestamps, scanning the footage, her fingers trembling over the trackpad, until she found it. The grainy, black and white video played in front of her, and the moment she saw what was happening on the screen, her stomach dropped, her breath hitching, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched in horror, her entire body going numb, a cold wave of realization washing over her, because it wasn't just an affair, it was something worse. What she saw next would push her past the point of no return. The house was silent, eerily still, except for Linda's ragged breathing. The metallic scent of blood filled the air, thick and suffocating, clinging to every surface like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Her hands trembled violently, the knife slipping from her grasp and clattering onto the blood-soaked floor. She could still hear the echoes of the struggle, the gasps, the shouts, the desperate scramble of bodies colliding, the sickening sound of steel-piercing flesh. But now, there was only silence. She staggered backward, pressing her palm to her mouth as if to hold back the scream threatening to tear through her throat. Jacob's body lay sprawled across the floor, his lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling, unseeing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic movements, until, suddenly, it didn't. Linda sucked in a sharp breath, panic gripping her like a vice as she turned her gaze to the other figure in the room. Grace. Grace was on her side, her body twisted unnaturally, blood pooling beneath her, her fingers twitching slightly as if grasping for something just out of reach. A gurgled breath escaped her lips, weak and wet, and Linda's stomach lurched at the realization, she was still alive. Linda stumbled to her feet, her legs shaky, her vision blurred by tears and shock. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She hadn't planned this. Had she? The night had unraveled so quickly, spiraling out of control before she could even think, before she could even breathe. One moment, she was confronting them, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal, and the next. The knife. The memory came rushing back in flashes, disjointed and distorted, like pieces of a shattered mirror. Jacob lunging at her. His hands grabbing her wrists, his voice a snarl of anger and desperation. Grace screaming, her cries blending into the chaos. The sharp pain as she was shoved against the counter, the cool handle of the knife beneath her fingertips, the instinctive reaction to defend herself, then the warm, sticky sensation of blood on her skin, the horrified expression on Jacob's face as he staggered back, clutching his stomach, crimson seeping through his shirt. And then there was Grace. Linda barely remembered turning the knife on her, barely recalled the moment the blade sliced through flesh again, but the evidence was all around her, on her hands, on the floor, on the walls. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her head spinning, and her pulse hammering against her skull as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with blood, making it hard to grip the device. She pressed the emergency dial with shaking hands, the ringing stretching for what felt like an eternity before a voice cut through the suffocating silence. 911, what's your emergency? Linda inhaled sharply, struggling to form the words, her voice barely above a whisper, raw and broken. There's blood everywhere. Her throat tightened as a sob escaped her lips. I think I killed them. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional, asking for her name, her location, details she could barely process. She could hear the distant wail of sirens now, growing closer, cutting through the night like a warning, a final, inescapable reckoning. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, beside the man she once loved and the mother who had betrayed her. The front door burst open moments later, uniformed officers flooding the space, weapons drawn, shouting commands she barely registered. They found her there, drenched in blood, her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto the bodies before her. Jacob was gone. Grace was barely clinging to life. And Linda. Linda had just crossed a line she could never uncross. But was this truly an act of passion, a desperate moment of self-defense? Or had something far darker been lurking beneath the surface all along? And in the end, would anyone ever believe her? The courtroom was packed with people, the air thick with tension, as every eye in the room remained fixed on Linda, who sat at the defense table, her face pale and her fingers gripping the edge of her chair with a tremble that betrayed the weight of the accusations against her. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a picture of a woman scorned, claiming she had not acted in self-defense but had instead carried out an act of premeditated murder fueled by revenge, humiliation, and an uncontrollable rage. The headlines had already decided her fate long before the trial had even begun, splashing bold and sensationalized words across newspapers and television screens alike, with phrases such as husband's affair ends in murder and mother-in-law's forbidden love capturing the public's morbid fascination with a case that seemed too twisted to be real. The details were impossible to ignore: a marriage shattered by betrayal, a mother who had crossed an unforgivable line, and a night that had ended in bloodshed and devastation. Linda's defense team fought back, insisting that she had been placed in an unimaginable situation, that she had no choice but to defend herself in the face of an escalating confrontation. They played the 911 call for the jury, letting them hear her shaking, panicked voice as she whispered that there was blood everywhere and that she thought she had killed them. They displayed the bruises on her arms, the defensive wounds that hinted at a struggle, and they painted a different picture of Jacob, not as an innocent victim but as an aggressor, a man who had deceived his wife and placed her in a situation that spiraled out of control. The jury remained silent and expressionless as each piece of evidence was laid before them: security footage showing Linda uncovering hidden notes, screenshots of late-night text messages exchanged between Jacob and Grace, and photographs of their secret meetings that had taken place right under Linda's nose. The trial had already taken a turn against her, but just when it seemed that every angle had been explored, the prosecution revealed something no one had expected. A letter. Discovered among Jacob's personal belongings, written in Grace's precise and elegant handwriting, its contents sent a ripple of shock through the entire courtroom as the prosecutor read the words aloud with slow, deliberate emphasis. Linda knows. Be careful. She said she'd rather see us dead than together. A murmur spread through the crowd, low whispers exchanging speculation, as Linda sat frozen in her chair, her breath caught in her throat, her hands suddenly clammy with sweat. Her eyes darted toward the jury, searching their faces for any indication of belief, doubt, or even sympathy, but they remained unreadable, their expressions giving nothing away. The letter had changed everything. It twisted the story once more, raising a question no one had considered before: had Grace truly been warning Jacob, fearful for their lives, or had she written those words with an entirely different intention, setting the stage for Linda to take the fall? The uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog, and as the judge pounded the gavel to signal the beginning of the closing arguments, Linda couldn't shake the creeping realization that this letter may have sealed her fate. The jury was sent to deliberate, the weight of the case now resting in their hands, but as Linda sat there, staring at the damning letter that had just rewritten the entire narrative. A single, haunting thought refused to leave her mind. Had Grace known from the very beginning how all of this would end? And if she had, then the most terrifying question of all remained: had Linda ever truly stood a chance? You've heard the evidence, you've seen the betrayal, and now it's time for you to decide, was this a crime of passion, or was something far more calculated at play? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I want to hear what you think. And if this story sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life horror and true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new mystery. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. Until next time, stay safe, and trust no one.